Ann Friedman, ladies and gentlemen. Ann Friedman. Well, thank you for joining us in a night that is, as every night in Kansas City, crowded with events. So you're not Chiefs fans, or as much to be daring the chill. You can see it also retrospectively. Or Joyce DiDonato fans, and so thank you, because there's also a big concert. So it is great that you chose to spend some of this afternoon with us, in which we're going to be discussing and talking about this incredible novel that Ann Friedman has published and that devoted a lot of her time. But before that, because this is an art tasting, I want to pour, and because it's French subject, or in France, a wonderful French wine. I'm sorry, later on you might join us for more drinks upstairs, but today, and let me share this is really delicious, so I'm sorry not to be able to share it with you, but it's Clos La Chapelle, Pommard, Premier Cru. So this is Bourgogne, and of course it's to be the Bourgogne appellation has to be 100% Pinot Noir. And this is, you can smell it while talk. This is great is one of 552 bottles. So this is very boutique and very special. But the great news is that you can find it at Gomer's. So this is a plug. And the reason you can find it at Gomer's is because the propriétaire récoltant, meaning the owner of these wines and of the lands in which the grapes are produced, happens to be a Kansas Cityan. And Mark O'Connell, who happens to be also a board member of the museum and who's here with us, make sure that in Kansas City we can taste some of his best wine. So this is a great thing that we can enjoy, and let me tell you, it's just delicious. Sorry that we cannot share it with all, but cheers, and to Anne for this incredible book. How many of you have been here before for another art tasting? Oh, fabulous. So you know, this is, as much as it is an art tasting, it is also a departure because it's more literary. But definitely this book is so anchored in the exhibition that we have right now. It could not be better tuned. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to channel. When I was living in France, there was a TV show, and that again tells you a lot about the French culture. On public French television, France 2, they had a literary every week show called Apostrophe, and authors would come and they'd be interviewed by a man who would always play with his glasses. And at the time, it's like, that is so, why is he always doing that? Now you'll see me doing that because I have grown up to the age in which you also have to do that. So in the best of I'm going to try to channel Bernard Pivot, who was the man, the genius, literary critic that also ran a magazine called of literature, but who had a TV show that withstood like 20 years introducing and talking to others. So in my best of that, you all know Anne, because she now has been with the Nelson-Atkins, was with the Nelson for many, many years. But people in the Nelson-Atkins knew her as our grants writer. But behind every grants writer, there is the most important part, the writer. The writer and the passionate person of history. And I don't know if you recall, but one of the first things that you did upon me coming to the Nelson-Atkins, you presented me a short story. And you know, and I'm still, I wanted to have this.
Shuttle cart.
The title being?
Death of a Shuttle Cart.
Death of the Shuttle Cart. And in this short story, if I can sum it up, the new museum director who introduces the shuttle cart to the Nelson dies very quickly. But there's a happy ending. The happy ending being that after the death of this new director, the fundraising for his memorial happens to be tremendous. And so that was our first introduction to her literary aspirations.
And Julián said that he was happy to learn that his death would benefit the museum, but he didn't feel like it just yet.
I think it will be better in a few years. So,
yes.
So after having read that, and after reading also the other skis for the next novel, but this was the one that was published. And when we knew that we were bringing the Napoleon exhibition, and this novel takes place in the midst of the Napoleon era, and I think it could have not been better timed. And so tell us, first of all, because of course you didn't write it for the exhibition,
No.
but how did you started being interested in first the Napoleonic era and also on describing how did you find out about this, who's a woman artist, who was the wife of Gros, and how did you decide to make her the character of your novel?
I had written a book. I had done a great deal of research on Gros and his paintings for Napoleon, and I had written a book about them that could not find a publisher. So I had all this research available to me. And Gros and Augustine had a very unhappy marriage, and all of his biographers laid the blame for the unhappy marriage solely on her. But I had...
Which was maybe a very chauvinistic way to do it. You know?
Yes. Here.
I'm trying to think. Okay, yes,
there.
here it is.
And here she is, Augustine Dufresne. And so I started to wonder about their marriage and started to wonder, well, what were the faults on both sides? And when they married, she was 19, he was 38, his mother was 60, and they went on living with his mother for the first 22 years of their married life.
So is there something to be honest, unhappy marriage? 22 years with your mother-in-law? Maybe.
But she was an artist, and I tried Googling her, and I could not find any images of works by her, although I could find auction records for them. And so I'm writing a novel about an artist whose paintings I have never seen. And but also because she was married to Gros, because he was such a central part of the Napoleonic period, the Napoleonic artistic circle, I knew that she served as a great focal point for many of the artists of the period. And so I wrote the book between 2000 and 2008, and then spent 8 years trying to get a publisher for it until it was finally picked up by Accent Press, which is a British press located in Cardiff.
In Cardiff?
Cardiff.
Yeah, I lived there. So, how many of you have seen that we are featuring this book in our museum store? Okay, you can all pick it up there, and she is willing to sign it after this event, okay? But one of the things that is very interesting, and one of the things that we'll go through, is the fact that as much as Gros and her are the main characters and how they play off, and the fact that you're putting yourself in the perspective of the women artist that she is, and we'll see the period of the time and the artist evolving through her perspective. One of the very interesting things is you are situating this, of course, in the Napoleonic times, and with the backdrop of the exhibition, some of the images that we'll see are in the exhibition, some others are not, but the paintings, and perhaps because you're so close to living in the museum world, almost the paintings become characters of your novel. You know, they're moments, inflection points, and moments in which the narrative is centered. So we might go to, well, this is a very important character.
Yes, this is Dominique Vivant-Denon, who was the director of the Musée Napoleon, today the Musée du Louvre. And he was a friend of Augustine's father. And he was the one who arranged her marriage to Antoine-Jean Gros. And this portrait is in the exhibition.
And actually, what will go in this conversation is most of the things, like the fact that it was an arranged marriage and that he played a part of it, those are your historical research based on,
Yes.
on real data from which then you extrapolate. So what is fiction and what is not?
I've lived with the semi-fictional version so long that sometimes I'm not sure what is fiction and what is not. But as much as I could, I stuck to the facts. But her emotional reactions, her thoughts, her words, those are all things that I invented.
So that is the canvas that you draw, but all anchored on some elements of reality. And so here we see some of the characters that we
Yes, the painting on the left is Françoise Gérard's portrait of Antoine-Jean Gros, her husband. This is when he was 20, long before he met her. He and Gérard had been friends. They were both students of Jacques-Louis David in David's studio. They later had a falling out, but when this portrait was painted, they were friends and they painted portraits of each other. And Gérard is not only represented in the exhibition, he's the one who did the coronation portrait of Napoleon, but he's also in the Nelson-Atkins collection. And on the right, you see the portrait of a gentleman, which is upstairs in the galleries.
And these portraits definitely have an amazing life. But in your book, they come alive. And
Yes.
one of the very interesting and subtle ways is the way you depict both the fashion of the time, the way that you give a lot of flavor to this. And it is also, I think, the fact that you're seeing it through her eyes, and she's attentive to all the details also in that sense. And we'll see that more as we move along. But as I was saying, some of the paintings become also anchors of the narrative, but also like characters themselves. And perhaps this is the one that you situate. A lot of things happen around this one masterpiece by Gros.
This is by Gros. It's Napoleon in the pest house at Jaffa. If you've taken an art history survey, this is probably the painting by Gros that comes up the most often. It's a scene from the Egyptian campaign. Napoleon has left Cairo and he's moving to besiege Acre. But meanwhile, in Jaffa, his troops fall prey to the bubonic plague, which was endemic in those areas. And here he visits a plague hospital to rally his men, to try to reassure the men. The visit was in 1798. The painting was from 1804 and was displayed just before he becomes emperor. So the Napoleon that you see depicted here is not the thin young general, such as you see in the Appiani portrait. He's Napoleon as he appeared in 1804. And he's reaching out his hand to touch one of the buboes, one of the
pestiferated, or
yes, the inflammations of the disease. And it's reminiscent of a king, the king's touch, which was believed to heal skin disease when the Bourbons were kings. And the painting is about the size that you see it here on the screen. It's about 16 by, I think, 12 by 16 feet, and is and was a great sensation of the Salon of 1804 when it was debuted. And
you anchor the encounter of your young character and painters with her first lover, in front of this painting. Another thing that also, of course, in choosing a big painting subject for the Salon, the artists were mixing history, and so those are also the big things that got your attention, no, for the Salon.
Yes.
And this also has almost a biblical undertone that can play to a certain degree.
Yes, and the figure that I keep drawing attention to is the one of the doctor in the lower right corner with the dying patient in his lap, and the doctor is dying as well. And one day she goes to the salon and she's trying to copy that figure and runs into a young man who is crying silently in front of it. And he says, well, that man was my uncle. And after the young man leaves, she hears someone laughing in the background and says to him, "Who are you?" And he looks at her and shakes his head and slumps and says, "Jacques Dubois, artist's model, at your service." And so it points out that this is a construction. It is something that the painter thought up, not something that was that he was an eyewitness to.
But that it's so real in a way. It has a reality that someone, in this case your character, that is this young man, imagines or feels that it is his uncle or someone he knows. And from that ensues an infatuation between the two of them.
Yes.
And then what happens?
And this is when I was trying to decide what had led her to marry a much older man. And I thought, well, maybe she had a young man who was attached to the army and got killed in the wars, and that's why she had to settle for someone twice her age. And I decided to base my depiction of the young man on this portrait by Gros of Dominique Alexandre Legrand, who used to be known as Charles Legrand, and that's what I call him in the book. He was a page in the court of Napoleon, Dominique Alexandre was, and then was commissioned a second lieutenant in the army and sent to Spain, where he was killed in the uprising of the 2nd of May, 1808. And she's heartbroken over this. The portrait, I knew nothing about the young man. I was just basing my character on the portrait. And then I was delighted to discover that he's here as part of Napoleon Power and Splendor. The other painting on the screen is Goya's painting of the 3rd of May, 1808. And this is the French retaliation for the killings of the 2nd of May. And again, it's one of those standards of icons of art history that will show up in your surveys. And in the painting, Goya pays great attention to the Spanish victim, but the French are faceless. They're just lined up as a killing machine. And I wanted to juxtapose these two because here is a face of the French, and the face is of a 17-year-old boy.
Yeah, and those are two, well, he's a character early on that puts a lot of things in motion. And here we have also Gros at all his portraiture.
Right, and Gros was well known as a portraitist, and you can see why. These are two of the paintings that are in the exhibition, the portrait of Duroc on the left and the portrait of Pierre Daru on the right.
And Duroc becomes also a very important character, or a character that you mention throughout your novel.
Yes, yes. He was the director of the Bâtiment de l'Empereur. He was the head of the king's household.
And at one point, we'll come to that Napoleon comes and tries to get some pieces of art for himself. But then this is also an amazing painting that you featured again as a central element of your novel.
Yes.
Takes us further.
Yes, Gros was known for Jaffa. He was also known for his battle paintings, and this is one of the best examples, Murat at the Battle of Abu Qir. It was not a commission for Napoleon, it was a commission for Murat. Napoleon actually led the troops in the Battle of Abu Qir, but as you can see, he's nowhere in the painting. And Murat and his wife were living, who was Napoleon's sister, Caroline, and he and his wife were living in the Élysée Palace, which is now the residence of the President of France. So they had the space to put a 20 or 30-foot painting up on the walls. And this is, the French are charging from the left. This is the Turkish army. The French had invaded Egypt, and Egypt at that time was one of the dominions of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire. And they sent Turkish troops under Mustafa Pasha, who's the angry-looking figure in the green turban. And the French routed them in the land battle of Abu Qir. And here is Murat, who is charging forward on his horse, accepting the sword of surrender from Mustafa's son. But meanwhile, the troops are fleeing, and they're fleeing into the Mediterranean. And I have Augustine take Charles to see it, and Charles he's a soldier. He's not an art historian or much of a connoisseur of painting. It's a battle. Where is the blood? There's got to be more than that little drip coming from Mustafa's hand. There's no blood. And she replies, there's no blood, but look, the color red is everywhere, suggesting it. To show blood would make this a scene of carnage, not battle. It would be too specific. A painting of battle, I explained, paraphrasing what I had learned from my teachers, elevates the scene. It's not just Murat and Mustafa, but also good versus evil, the brave versus the cowardly, and here the good and brave are winning. The artist suggests a large, messy battle, but distills it to its essentials. Earnest and passionate in defense of the painter's art, I was finding an eloquence I had not known I possessed. But what about the naked men? Surely they're not essential to battle. To battle itself? No. They belong to battle painting. Why add this and subtract that and elevate the next thing? Why not just show what really happened? Wouldn't that be simpler? It would be illustrative, but it wouldn't be art.
So that passage in the book also illustrates something that we'll see more. There were ranks in what the subjects were when you were doing painting, and also when you're submitting this to the salon. So
Yes.
there were rankings. Portrait was below landscape, or history painting was the biggest subject in religious subjects too. And in that way, to distinguish oneself when one would send works of art to the salon, you needed to have exactly grandeur. And battle paintings have had its definitions. And again, realism, it's very true that that feeling comes from that time, which would not be 100 years later the same.
Yes.
And now, of course, once she marries, Gros, she can get to see...
Her boyfriend is killed. Then her father dies shortly thereafter, and that is, in fact, true. And Vivant Denon sees the family of his friend, and...
It's alive, just saying.
sees the family of his friend and wants to help support them. So he arranges for Gros to meet Augustine and proposes that they get married. And because this happened the same year that Gros was painting this portrait of Josephine, I put a scene in the book where Gros takes Augustine out to Malmaison, where Josephine's private residence, and she assists him in selecting the shawls that will be used for the portrait. And afterwards, he takes her into the rose garden, and there he makes his formal proposal. The portrait of Josephine, alas, is not part of the exhibition, but the portrait of the Marascot family is. And Madame Marascot is wearing a very similar shawl to Josephine's.
And to the one you're wearing today.
And to the one I'm wearing.
Which is the one that Josephine gives to the character in the book.
Yes.
It's all connected. Now, who has seen the Napoleon show? Well, almost everyone. So the surprise that the curator that organized the show was when he was negotiating the painting of the family of Marascot. That painting still remains in the same family from descendants. And so he was negotiating the painting to come on this show. And the family said, well, you can have the painting, but would you like to have the same shawl which we still have in the family. So that shawl is in the galleries, and you will see it next to the painting, and has remained in the family since this painting was painted. So that is also gives you in-depth and touch almost of 200 years ago. So that is fascinating too. And you see the vividness and the beauty of both the textiles. But that is also what comes alive in your description of how those precious things and the gesture of Josephine giving her one to keep. That was just amazing.
Thank you. And when they get married, Gros' brother-in-law was a marchand mercier, which is a dealer in luxury goods. And I have the marchand mercier give her this clock as a wedding present. It's a clock that's in the Nelson-Atkins collection. It's upstairs in the same gallery as the Gerard portrait.
And that's also what's great is how you populated the book, not only with incredible works of art, but also things that refer to our own collection. A lot of people, I mean, all of us would wish that it had been illustrated, but I'm sure that in the publication world is impossible still even today.
It would have cost a great deal for rights and permissions, and I would have been the one covering that cost.
Having to cover that cost.
But thanks to the internet, you can Google most of these things.
Today, exactly, today, and because they're all real and you reference them, it's very easy to find them.
And through Gros, she would have known most of the major artists of the time. His teacher was Jacques-Louis David. If you've been to any of the Napoleon talks, you've seen this image again and again. And there is a sketch for one of the ladies in waiting of Josephine that's in the exhibition.
And here we have David at his best.
Yes, 2 portraits by David, painted when he was in exile in Brussels after the Napoleonic era. The Comte de Turenne d'Enac and the 2 Bonaparte sisters, Zénaïde and Charlotte.
And then
this one, Girardet was Gros' best friend. And this is a painting that he did for the Gallery of Diana in the Palace of the Tuileries, which was Napoleon's residence while he was in Paris. And it has a funny story attached to it. There was a revolt in Cairo, and here you can see a Frenchman rushing in to help quell the revolt while the Arabs are fighting back. And it was painted for the Gallery of Diana, but then it was removed from the gallery and put into storage in the Louvre. And later on, which left some empty spaces on the walls. And later on, when Napoleon had married Marie-Louise and was coming to Paris and would just be there for one evening, the head of the household, Duroc's secretary, wrote to the secretary of the Louvre and said, "We've got to put some things up on the walls. What do you have?" The secretary said, "Well, I've got some tapestries, but they really wouldn't look so good. And then I've got this painting." And the household said, "Fine, send it." And then you see, this is all in the Archives Nationales, and then you have a letter from the secretary of the Louvre. "Well, I talked to the chef des gardiens, the head of the museum guards. They doubled as the art handling crew. And he said, and he reminded me that this was taken down in the first place because Marie-Louise didn't like it." And back comes a reply from the household. "Well, maybe she won't, it's only for one evening, maybe she won't dislike it as much as she used to. But as I recall, what she objected to was that big naked man in the front of the painting. And if that's the problem, surely it's easy enough to solve. We can ask Monsieur Girardet to make his nudity disappear." So Michelangelo is not the only one who has clothing painted on his figures. As you can see, this never happened, and my theory is that they put a torchère or a potted palm in front of it whenever they wanted to display it.
For one night.
For one
Exactly.
night.
And then a lot of course, the novel revolves about what it is to be a woman in that period and
Yes.
what to be a woman artist. And right now, it's so timely also that your book has come out because many institutions are revisiting the canon and much more attention is being paid to women artists. In particular, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who had recently a retrospective at the Met and at the Paris. And so women artists are starting to become more visible. And you set a whole group of artists that would meet in a woman's studio.
Yes. And Vigée-Lebrun was a friend of Gros' father. She had known him since he was a little boy. And so certainly Augustine would have met her. And here I show her self-portrait of 1783 when she was admitted to the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, and also our portrait by Vigée-Lebrun, the Duchesse de Caderousse.
But the setting that you create is around Benoit's studio.
Is around Marie-Guillemine Benoit. And she was also a pupil of Jacques-Louis David, and so Gros would certainly have known her. Here's her self-portrait while she's in David's studio. She's copying one of his paintings. And also the portrait for which she is best known, the portrait of a black woman. France had outlawed slavery in 1794. This is painted in 1800. And I think the sheer beauty and dignity of its subject speaks for the dignity of black people under the empire.
At that time, yeah, and it is one of those amazing masterpieces of the Louvre worth a visit by itself. And then we have
she was the only woman artist commissioned by First Consul Bonaparte to paint his portrait. It's still in the courthouse in Ghent. And she was given commissions for the royal family, Napoleon's sister Elisa, Countess of Tuscany, and the painting that's in the exhibition that is possibly by Madame Benoit is the Comte de Ségur, who was Napoleon's master of ceremonies.
And that painting tells you all the delicacy of the brushstroke, and all you feel the textiles come to life when you visit the show. You'll see that. One of the very interesting things, you set then Benoit's studio as the place where women artists would congregate, would talk, and everything. But very interestingly, also in her biography, Benoit is almost the breadwinner in the family, while her husband, who's here depicted by her, is the doctor that accompanies Napoleon in his missions.
This is actually, it's not Benoit, it's Benoit's sister.
Benoit's sister.
And she was Elizabeth Charlotte Larrey. This is, again, this is another woman artist who was very active in the period, of which I have no images, not even a portrait of her, nor any works by her. Larrey was the chief surgeon of Napoleon's armies, the chief surgeon of the Imperial Guard, and was a medical innovator in his own right, which I won't go into here. He was, for the first 20 years of their marriage, he was away on campaign for 13 of those years. And very often his pay was in arrears. He had to pay for his own medical implements out of his pay. And so the one who stayed home in Paris and kept the family going by painting portraits was Elizabeth Charlotte. I call her Charlotte in the book. And to me, she's one of the unsung heroines of the Napoleonic period. And at one point, he writes to her and says, the emperor owes me back pay. Could you please go petition him to get the back pay from him, paint a nice portrait, paint a miniature portrait of him and put it in a nice frame and present it to him when you ask.
And here are some
And then
incredible.
Augustine's best friend was a landscape artist, Louise Josephine Sarrazin de Belmont, who was born the year after Josephine. Josephine was, sorry, not Josephine, the year after Augustine. Augustine was born in 1789, the year of the Revolution. Sarrazin de Belmonte was born in 1790 and had a very long life. She died the year after the Franco-Prussian War. And she was a landscape artist. She never married. She supported herself by her art. And Josephine was one of her patrons, and also the Duchesse de Berry, the niece of Louis XVIII after the Napoleonic era had ended.
And they go together to...
At the end of the book, they go together to Rome.
Rome, and exactly. Rome, it's part of the ethos or the dream or the grand tour. And so for many artists, but she, as a woman, of course, she was at the during the years she was married, she had to stay with the married. There was no way that she could leave the household and go
travel herself.
But she, because she was never married, she would do that.
She could do that.
Bring back anecdotes or paintings of those travels and share it with the friends or the group of women painters that they were together.
Now, I couldn't find any views of women's studios in this period, so this is a view of the interior of an atelier of a woman painter from 1789 by Marie-Victoire Lemoine, who was one of Vigée Lebrun's students. And while male artists, especially ones who were members of the Academy, could, thank you.
Yes, we have to refresh them.
Well, male artists could have studios in the Louvre. Women artists didn't. Women artists mostly taught at home. And and this is an example of an 18th century artist atelier in a domestic interior. But for Madame Benoit's studio, I tried to imagine what it would be like, and tried to invent an intensely feminine place. A burst of light, color, warmth, and fragrance flooded my senses. Even now, almost 30 years later, I can close my eyes and inhale the deep, rich rose perfume exuded in the dead of winter by bowls of potpourri, candles, and the perfume worn by Madame Benoit herself. Draped everywhere were fabrics and shawls in rose colors, reds, oranges, yellows, and pinks, with here and there the deep greens of stems and leaves. Turbans and ostrich plumes were scattered among them. Candles flickered on tables and shelves. A corner stove gave off welcome heat, and a tea kettle boiled gently upon it. An old-fashioned Turkish-style divan stood against one wall with several chairs in front of it. A round table in their midst bore a plate of cakes and several cups and saucers, whose floral pattern, I was sure, would be rosebuds. Wide-eyed, I took it all in. Easels were there, and a model stand, sketches for her best-known paintings, plaster casts of ancient sculptures, colors, sketchbooks, and chalks, all the things with which a studio needed to be furnished. And the smell of turpentine could be detected even under the scent of roses. But the setting was intensely feminine, affirming that womanhood and serious art were not mutually exclusive. I drank it all in with a quickening sense of delight.
That's great. And here we have portraits.
Here are portraits by women artists, which are in the collections upstairs, in the permanent collection. A portrait that's possibly by Constance Meyer of a young boy with an earring. A portrait by Adelaide Labille-Guiard, who was Vigée Lebrun's chief rival in painting portraits. The portrait of Joachim Le Breton, and then a portrait attributed to Rose Adelaide Ducreux of the Comtesse de Langeron. Interestingly, the Mayer and the Ducreux both entered the collection as a David. They
were upgraded.
And then they were upgraded,
exactly,
yes.
To women artists. And then you based, because you have never found a painting by her.
No.
And so you had to imagine what she would have submitted to the Salon, and you have some descriptions, and then you chose as an image this image.
This one.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite paintings in the Louvre by Anne Coster, a still life of marine plant shells and corals. Valérie Coster was a still life artist, and this is typical of her work, the wonderful detail of it and the juxtaposition of colors and the way everything pops out of that black background. And Augustine's painting for the Salon in 1814 was scallop shells, was a group of scallop shells painted on linen. So I stole this for her debut painting.
Well, you made a reattribution that maybe 20 years from now, art historians will say you were right. Maybe it is Augustine's. But so she participates in the Salon, and this is what you could have find her painting along with, correct?
Yes.
This was some of the highlights.
And she participates in the Salon. Now, before we get into it, I just want to say, unfortunately, Madame Benoit did not participate in this Salon. This was the first Salon after Napoleon had abdicated and removed himself to Elba, and the Bourbon kings had come back in the person of Louis XVIII. And Madame Benoit's husband was one of the people who had negotiated for their return and became a member of the government. And he wrote to his wife and said, well, in my new position as one of the ministers of the government, it's no longer appropriate that you should be displaying art in public exhibitions. Please don't send anything this year. And she had been displaying an exhibition. She had been displaying at the Salon since 1791, since it was first opened to anyone, not just members of the Academy. And she acceded to his request. She wrote to a friend saying that she was disappointed, but we live in society and we must obey society's rules. But still, you can't help but feel how much it would have broken her heart not to be able to do this. Her father had been a minister for Louis XVI, and when she was young, she would display in other exhibitions in Paris. But with the Restoration, they were becoming, what shall I say, more Bourbon than the Ancien Régime, and so she wasn't allowed to display. This is an assortment of the paintings.
But let me just also chime in, because one of the things I like about the novel, and what I like also about when a historic novel takes you, is that through your fiction you account for maybe those ambiguities that a history book, and actually, by the way, we have great history books also on sale at the museum store if you want to deepen your experience of Napoleon. And if you're going to go even deeper, of course, our library is there at your service. But what it's important, and what you don't get sometimes in history books, is that kind of more intimate feelings, as you were saying also. What are the crises that happen when the Restoration happens, and how some people feel disenfranchised? And in Augustine, what I like, and there's a whole passage in which the ambivalence also that some people might have felt. Look, if we're living complex times, those must have been even more complex than whatever we're living today. Just imagine going from different regimes back and forth, the royalty and not. And the fact that what it comes out by her own anguish, her husband is very supportive, of course, of the Napoleonic era. He was commissioning and painting, so a lot of artists also are changing with the wind. And all of a sudden, he feels disenfranchised when the Bourbons come and they don't ask him for commissions. All of a sudden, Gros is put aside. But Augustine is great because she favors more the royalty, but at the end of the day, and you're very subtle in those descriptions and moods, what people do want is a stability. At the end of the day, an artist wants just to have commissions, whoever commissions them. So there's a very interesting way, even though I feel from some of the commissions and some of that what Napoleon does bring to the artist, and you can see it in the show, and that's why we're doing a show about this particular era, is that sense, a very French sense of grandeur. He had something that was beyond, and something that we can see in certain images, even just like this wounded cuirassier. Your history is being aggrandized, and Napoleon brings that twice, actually.
Yes, yes, and Gros actually, the Bourbons of the Restoration did employ him as a portraitist and to do some major paintings. It was after the July Revolution of 1830 in Louis Philippe that he was out of favor. But she goes to she's at the Salon of 1814, that's where her painting is, and she comes across this one, which is one of the masterpieces by Theodore Géricault, of the wounded cuirassier leaving the field of battle. And if he's wounded, he's not bleeding, it's more psychological wounds. And 1814 is after Napoleon's defeat in Russia. It's after the European coalition has defeated him, sent him into exile, and the cuirassier sums up this depressed feeling of France during this period with the gray sky, the nervous horse. He's leaving the field of battle, but it's just not quite sure what he's going into next.
And this is the retrenchment of France, and this is also very symbolic. But now there's a moment also of a bit of gossip in your novel that you invented. Then it is 100% invented, and this is about the affair that Augustine may have had. But psychologically, it's 100% plausible. And tell us about that. And how you anchored it around this painting.
Augustine at this point has been married to Gros for 10 years, and she's in this middle-aged household. They haven't had any children. And she meets Géricault. Géricault was a big...
So she's in her 30s.
She's in her 20s.
He's in the late 20s.
She's in her 20s, and he's only a couple of years younger than she is.
Exactly, Géricault.
Géricault. And he's a painter of wonderful power, and she finds herself attracted to him. And
so this is the fiction part, but you'll see psychologically so real.
This is fiction. And she, and as I say, he admires her husband's work a great deal. He does many copies after Gros. And she decides that she's going to be very bold, and she's going to be very bold. She's going to go to his studio and basically throw herself at him. And she
at the younger man.
Exactly. And she goes to his studio in 1819, and of course I had to have him working on this painting, which again is one of the icons of French art history, the Raft of the Medusa. The Medusa was a ship that had sunk, and by the sheer incompetence of its captain, and he let the survivors loose on a raft that floated in the ocean for days. And by the time they were discovered, there were only a few of them left, and they were a tattered crew. They had resorted to cannibalism to survive. And Géricault takes the mere facts of this and makes...
This was the tabloids story of that time, in the middle of all the upheaval, but that was what captured the newspapers of the time.
Yes. And in Napoleon's time, 150 lives were lost, and in Napoleon's time, that's a minor skirmish on the outlying a battle. But in Louis XVIII's time, this was a major tragedy. And
the cannibalism element, I think, is what also, if I remember correctly, a lot of people seized their imagination that in order to survive, some of these people had to eat the flesh of the other survivors. So that was very polemical also at the time.
Yes.
And that's why it was a subject that everyone had heard of. And Géricault chooses also as something that will bring him fame at the Salon.
Yes. And she goes there with the intention of throwing herself at him. but she finds, but unfortunately for her, her plans are frustrated by the fact that Eugene Delacroix is there. And Delacroix, in fact, did pose for one of the figures in the painting. It's in the front and center, the man with the curling black hair that's face down. That was Delacroix.
So now, if this book becomes a film and a movie, we might need to depart so that there is a love affair here and a magical triangle. But it is, in this, just the desire is as his apogee, and of course, Delacroix, who is also their contemporary,
Yes.
is just there, a bit younger.
He's a few
even than
younger,
Géricault.
yes. Now, Géricault was having an affair at the time. He was having an affair with his uncle's young wife, and they had a child together.
So he was busy.
So he was
It's
busy.
not that he didn't like her, but he was already overcommitted.
And, and again, we have paintings by both Géricault and Delacroix in the galleries. These are both up in one of the block galleries upstairs. The Oath of Brutus following the death of Lucretia.
And right now...
And Christ on the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, and this too are studies, of course, that we have in our galleries, but actually they're majestic even in the size. And right now, seeing them blown to the proportions of our screen, you see how well they hold. And I like always the studies because they have a much more quick impasto and quick painting, brushwork. And all of a sudden you see all the energy really well reflected. That sometimes the big one seems a bit more rigid in that sense. But these were amazing works that we have in our own collection. And I think the Met in New York still has the wonderful retrospective of Delacroix that can be seen at this time, and in which you will see Dante's boat too.
Yes, and this is another painting that appears in the book. Go on to the next one.
Yeah, and then here.
And then Augustine has to give up painting in the 1820s, or at least give up showing at the Salon. And I wondered why, and her mother was going blind at the time. I think she got caught up in caregiving. And as I mentioned, they had never had children. But in 1827, Gros had taken a mistress and had a young daughter with the mistress. The mistress was Françoise Simonier, and her daughter was Françoise Cécile. And I think you can see the difference between the painting of the wife, which is there's such a wariness about it, and the painting of the mistress, and there's such there's such open joy in it.
And the drama that is accurate and you research and that also in the film version will explode totally, is the fact that Gros disinherits everyone, or his wife, to give everything to the daughter. And then there's a whole...
In his will, he left his entire estate to his daughter instead of his wife, and then he made his wife one of the executors of the will.
Isn't that perverse?
Now that is about as bad as a marriage can get. The daughter couldn't inherit, however, because under French law, the child of an adulterous liaison cannot inherit if there is a legitimate heir, and the legitimate heir in this case was the wife.
And there's a very important lawyer that helps in the novel on all that. But that is also based on the Napoleonic Code.
Aha.
And so the Napoleonic Code, that is, again, what perhaps Napoleon himself said that would be his lasting legacy, is still what a lot of countries are more or less still organized through.
Now, Gros had, yes, this is by Gros, the same Gros who did Jaffa and the Battle of Abu Qir. Gros had been in favor during the Bourbons of the Restoration, but then you have the July 1830 revolution, and the new arts administration wants nothing to do with him. The head of the art said, Gros is a dead man. We can't expect anything from him. And he had turned away from the romanticism of his youth to pursue a hard-edged neoclassicism that didn't suit his talents as well. And finally, in 1835, he sends this painting does this painting of Hercules and the horses, Hercules and Diomedes. And her description of how she felt upon seeing it, I just took my own sentiments about it and wrote them into the book. I examined it attentively, then with growing dismay, desperately racking my brains to discover something, anything, to say about it. Its sheer awfulness left me speechless. The outlandishly sized figure of Hercules, bulging with muscles from head to extended foot, dominated the canvas. The absurdly smaller Diomedes struggled in his arms while the diabolical horses tore at his chest. His captor seemed neither pleased nor disgusted, triumphant nor sympathetic, but gazed to one side, not meeting the viewer's eye, with as indifferent an air as if he were killing an insect by drowning it in a basin of water. I have known men to show more agitation waiting for their dinner. The supposedly moral hero demonstrating stoic fortitude clearly had not a thought in his well-proportioned head. The coloring was cold, the outlines firm, the overall effect appalling. And this is the painting that he hopes will reestablish his reputation. He writes to the director of the arts saying, purchase it for the state. I want it to serve as an example for young painters. It's unfortunately in the Salon of 1835, it's hung very high where it catches the glare from the windows, so people can barely see it. And the critics who can see it dislike it intensely. And it's panned. And for Gros, this is the end of the line. About 6 weeks after the Salon opened, he took himself off. One evening he had dinner with his wife, and then took himself to the suburb of Meudon outside Paris, and threw himself into the Seine, committing suicide when he was 64 years old.
Isn't that a perfect ending for the movie? But now we need to know, finally she's free. She is no longer, the mother has died.
Her mother has died, his mother has died.
A few years before. Yeah.
A few years before, both of them. And Gros has died, and she's free to do what she likes. And in the book, I have her travel to Toulouse and there write her memoirs. Gros was buried in this family tomb at the cemetery of Père Lachaise. He's the, let me see, on the left, he's the second one from the bottom. She's the third one from the bottom. And it's very interesting that his epitaph on the tomb says merely Antoine-Jean Gros, peintre, painter, whereas her epitaph says Augustine Dufresne, widow of Gros, painter of Jaffa. So even after his death, even after her death, the fame of Jaffa persists for the family.
Supersedes everything.
Supersedes everything.
It's part of something that you mention often. And then she leaves everything to Toulouse.
And she lives for a few years more. In 1841, we know she's in Rome. That's where she writes her will. Comes back to Paris and dies in early January at the age of 52. We don't know what from. But she leaves the collection of her paintings by him to the Musée des Augustins in Toulouse, which still has them. And in the right-hand side, you can see in the upper right corner, you can just about see Hercules and Diomedes. And it's capturing that must have been how it appeared at the Salon, capturing the glare from the skylights.
And so in ending this conversation, I wanted to end it also quoting you. In the book, there's a passage that for any museum director is very beautiful. So you have Napoleon that goes, after he's just about to marry the Marie-Louise, he goes to see Denon and to see also the head of the now Louvre. And Bonaparte arrives and he says, the Archduchess will be here for her official wedding by the end of the month. He turns to Denon. Now her apartments must be made ready. I brought Duroc to pick out some of the treasures that you, by you is the director of the Louvre, you've been hiding in storage and put them to good use. Antoine introduced Marshal Duroc, the superintendent of the buildings, who oversaw the decorations of the royal apartment. So this is where you're also situating that character that we saw earlier. But then the director of the Louvre says, I assure you, Your Majesty, that I only put aside those things too delicate or too fragile, or I would say today, too light sensitive. And then the emperor, of course, responds, nonsense, Denon. If they fall apart, we can have new ones made. It will be even more impressive to show the world that we're wealthy, that we can treat these things as mere ornaments. That cabinet, for instance. So he goes on and on. You know, all of a sudden you say, on the one side, he was right. He was commissioning all the best artists to do things for his glory. On the other side, of course, Vivien Denon was right when he said, Sire, these are the treasures of France. And with that, again, thank you for holding the values of museum directors in your book so beautifully. And I raise my glass to the best grand writers we'll ever have and the most art historical, but it's good that now she will devote full time to writing more novels, and we look forward to reading many more of you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Salud. So I think we have a few minutes if anyone wants to ask burning questions that you have for her. Yes. Mm-hmm. But that shawl that stayed in the family, that's in the painting, and that's in the exhibit, people keep asking me, how did they protect that from moths and worms and what all over these years? Because cashmere, a lot of camphor, I think I would say. I mean, the old traditions, and it was very well packed, away from humidity, in a malle. How do you say malle?
A box.
In a box and in the attic, but in a dry condition, and with a lot of camphor and spices that helped prevent animals. From what I understand from the curator who told the story, on the one side, it seemed that they had protected and conserved it well enough, but I would not go as far as saying a lot of effort had been. It's more like, oh, we have something in the attic, then they opened the box and it was very well preserved. So good environment. At the end of the day, a very good, stable environment, and yeah. Any other burning questions? Oh, yes,
Marjorie. No, she asked if I would continue to write about this period in women artists. No, this is a standalone book. The current one that's under consideration by Accent Press is a whodunit set in Paris in the 1670s, a fine tapestry of murder. And the one that I'm working on now is Death in the Fountains of Versailles, also set in the 1670s. And I like to subtitle it, The Dissertation Repurposed.
So I was first taken when I started seeing some chapters of the one that you're now suggesting. And I remember you going to Paris to see if there was a special hatch door leading to the Seine for one of the escapes of the murder.
Yes.
And that you say, I have to change my whole chapter. And it's like, whoa, this is precise. I would have said there was a door at one point, and that's it. And you said, no, you changed some words in that.
Yes, I wanted to set the climactic scene where the villain gets hold of my amateur sleuth and threatens her, and I wanted to set it in the forge, in the foundry at the arsenal where the cannon were made, and I imagined that there was a river entrance to the foundry, and so I had him smuggle her across the river and up and into it. And then I came across some documents with plans of the arsenal, and it turned out that the foundry was not accessible from the river. It was in the fourth of 4 courts that he would have had to pass through, and that 2,000 soldiers were stationed in the arsenal at that time. And so he would have had to drag a buxom, comatose blonde through 4 courtyards of soldiers before I thought, no, this is not going to work.
But that is the passion that you bring and that I love, and that from the moment we started talking about what you were writing, I was like so clued in. The fact that on the one side, it is art historical on the one side when it's art historical, but also historically accurate, but also that you bring things then that come to life. So I know also the docent body has a book club, and you will be happy to know that your book is part of their book club.
Oh, good.
So they're doing that. We can't wait to see. You've published the next one, because did you enjoy this? Should we do another one when the next one comes?
Thank you.
So you're already
Thank you so much
for the next one. And again, I want to just encourage you to, it's a great read, and also it's a great Christmas gift if you have not thought of something to give to your favorite person. And she will sign it right now. So
yes.
Join us outside, and maybe we can go upstairs. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.